everyone, I'm Caroline Hill. I'm the editor of Legal IT Insider, and I'm your host on this Talking Tech episode today of legal AI agents, workflow ownership, and the dangers of agent washing. I'm here today with Definely to look at this really pressing the right word. It's a really interesting topic, certainly a very prominent topic around agentic AI. So as Gen AI adoption accelerates, obviously there's a lot of claims for tools to be agentic. So they're talking about transforming workflows and being fine-tuned for law. But what does that really mean? How do you separate marketing from genuine innovation? It's a problem that we're all facing with lots of different things at the moment. But in this session, we're going to cut through the noise of what agentic AI really should look like. So today I've got two speakers with me. You may be familiar with them both. So first up, I've got Rhys Hodkinson, who is Chief Revenue Officer at Definely. Rhys started his legal career as a trainee at Baker McKenzie, trainee solicitor at Baker McKenzie in South Africa. In 2018, he left the law and moved to the UK, where he got an MBA from Cambridge. And it was there that he was introduced to Definely's co-founder, Nnamdi, and says he was persuaded to join the company immediately. Hey, Rhys, how you doing?
Hey, Caroline, how's it going? Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you. I'm also joined by Shani Isaacson, who's Definely's head of AI. Shani started with Definely in April 2024. Before that, he was at a consumer. He started a consumer fintech business that helps families invest. He was also a machine learning engineer at Eigen Technologies, which is a name that some of you will know. And he's held AI research roles outside of legal. Hi, Shani. Nice to see you. So fine. So just briefly, quick in terms of agenda, it's going to be interactive. The guys are going to answer your questions. Thanks for saying hi in the chat. Please keep your chat on. If you've got a question, jump in at any time. We like to keep these sessions really interactive. The purpose of having a webinar is to encourage you to ask your questions as well. In terms of the agenda, so we're going to be talking about some basic stuff around basic or not basic, depending on your perspective. We're all learning, including me, very much so. What is an agent? What they're capable of. We're going to be talking about whether you need an agent. There's a lot of claims around agentic AI in terms of you need an agent for this, that, the other. Do you need it? We're going to be looking at proprietary contract structure and how you improve AI accuracy. We're going to be looking at evaluating AI tools and hopefully giving you some really good practical questions to take back to vendors in terms of the sort of things that you can be looking out for to avoid falling into perhaps some of the marketing spiel. I think if we start off, so Rhys, do you want to kick us off? So I suppose the first question, what is an agent?
Well, I'm going to do the classic technique of palming off to Shani straight away. So we agreed for all of the technical. I'm probably going to mess up the definition. So I think Shani, with all of the experience, could probably give us the technical definition of what constitutes an agentic AI system.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I'll try to keep this not too technical, but for me, the core definition of an agentic system is a system that doesn't only generate outputs for the user, but can take actions on their behalf by interacting with some tools or some software. So essentially, you can look at it that an agentic system needs to contain three different things. The first of it would be like the reasoning layer, and usually we use large language models for that layer. So that reasoning layer kind of interprets your instructions and plans what it needs to do. The second part is access to tools. So in our context, this would be things like APIs, legal software, DMS, databases, email, etc. Basically where the information that you need to do end-to-end workflows lives for lawyers. And the third part is complete workflow ownership. So the agent can follow an end-to-end workflow and complete it and not just provide isolated answers. For me, if you have those three ingredients, that's what I would call an agentic system. Otherwise, you might be a bit far away from it. I can give an example as well that goes into legal if you want, but that's kind of how I it.
Jump in.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, like the classic example that we often take is when you're drafting a contract, right? The agent can help you identify which provisions you are missing, first of all. It can then, because it has access to the DMS, it can retrieve those provisions for you from similar contracts as the one you're working on. It can then redraft it to fit within the contract you're working on. It can define any definitions that this will introduce by inserting it, and it can then automatically insert it into your contract for you. So here, it did a lot of different steps by using a lot of different tools, and not just one simple task at a time.
Yeah.
So that's what I would call a complete agentic system.
Okay. And obviously that's an example, as you say. I probably should have gone into more detail about this. Isn't a webinar about Definely per se, but obviously you're going to be reflecting on some of your own technology, and that would fit into a use case from Definely. So yeah, so I mean, I suppose another technical questions. We're going to do more of we're going to do a deep dive. But so what are people saying that agents are capable of, perhaps that they're not capable? What are you seeing in terms of, either of you, in terms of what we call agent washing? You know, there's some big claims being made. What are you seeing at a high level?
I'll let Shani go first, and then I've got lots to say on this.
That's I'll talk a bit about what I think about when I hear agent washing, if I'm being honest. So not necessarily in terms of like what they aren't capable, but more in terms of when I hear agent washings, I feel like it's more like when vendors slap the word agent on products that are really just a chatbot with a single integration, or just a very narrow automation, and it's dressed up like an agent. And when I say a narrow automation, I mean softwares that do one specific deterministic task really well, like let's say fill in the party names for a template, auto insert some boilerplate language into an NDA, run a spell check on a document. Like these are really powerful and good automations that we all need, but it's not agentic because it requires no reasoning or no selection and no interpretation of instructions. So I feel like that's something that a lot of providers are doing. They're just taking what has been like possible for many years and just slapping an agent on it. It's kind of like, sorry if I again like refer to like our product. We have a proofreading product, right? It's incredibly powerful. We could start calling it an agent because it finds all your errors and fixes them, but that wouldn't really be true, right? That would just be marketing. So that's kind of what I feel like when I hear agent washing, I feel like a lot of people are trying to do that.
Yeah. Reece.
I think, maybe just talking more from the customer's perspective, where obviously I spend a lot of my time. I think, so, we straddle both the law firm and the in-house side of things, and what you can have is quite a lot of basically like analysis paralysis when it comes to trying to sift through the noise, because some new trendy word comes out, whether it's generative AI or AGI or agentic AI or ambient agents, and then everyone's just slapping that onto their titles, and it's hard to discern the signal from the noise. So, we spend a lot of time with prospects and customers, and they're sort of saying, well, everyone's saying they've got an agent. I don't really know what this means. And, Shani and I were talking about this, and I'll get back to people forget that oftentimes if you look at some of the use cases that people are coming out for things like generative AI or even agentic systems, like complete this form for me or input this and create a template, some of the software has been around for 4 or 5 years, right? We using agents as like a very cool way to solve for problems that have already been solved for. And you've got to remember that the way agentic systems work, the way that generative AI systems work, is they are the most expensive solution to your problem. And so your problem needs to be a problem that cannot be solved without these systems. So yes, there's good marketing and saying agentic, and it might get you a foot into the door to do a demonstration, but you also need to take a step back and say, well, is what they're doing here, first of all, a highly valuable workflow or task that's been solved? But secondly, is this a workflow that I could solve with traditional machine learning techniques, right? Or other deterministic outputs, which don't come with having to run 6 large language models and embeddings technology and host things on AWS at an exorbitant cost. And I think as we're getting more mature in this area, questions are being asked about ROI. And, one part of it is return, but the other part of it is investment, right? And if you can reduce your investment by solving for problems with the most feasible solution, you can cut through this. Now, what we're not saying is that agentic systems are not powerful. They are extremely powerful. This is probably, even next to generative AI, much more of a powerful outcome, especially for lawyers, right? Because even generative AI still requires the lawyer to create an input, whether it's the prompt, get the output, and then have to do things with the output, right? Whether that's copy the output into an email or copy the output into a contract, reformat that output to fit into the contract. Or, one of the complaints we always hear from lawyers is, I spend as much time validating the accuracy of the output as I would have spent just creating the output for myself in the first instance, right? The sort of robbing Peter to Paul kind of example. Whereas agentic systems can, if deployed properly and if built correctly, can actually mirror the way that lawyers complete workflows, right? So I can actually get the agent to start executing on my behalf and taking actions based on that output. Now, to Shani's point, which I think is such a huge point, is that is not possible if you are a single integration product, right? Because, and this is sort of where we get confused, because everyone's pushing marketing, and maybe we do this a little bit, but we're not agent washing, that's for sure, is think about what is it that an agent's doing. An agent is trying to mirror how lawyers complete their workflows. Generative AI is still enhancing the workflows that they can complete and making it easier to complete certain workflows, but it requires the lawyer to really go in and still complete all of the tasks. And then you need to think, well, how does a lawyer complete a specific workflow? So when I was a lawyer, for example, I would typically have multiple different products, software solutions open simultaneously to allow me to draw on different pieces of information, to access different products, to then curate a final product, right? Whether it's my DMS system, my email, Microsoft Word, probably 2 or 3 plugins into Microsoft Word that's sold for bespoke contract drafting tasks that I'm all leveraging at the same time. For an agent to be able to also go and recreate that workflow, it needs equal access into all of those software systems. An agent that does not own the underlying workflow cannot mirror complex legal tasks in the way that a lawyer completes them to actually make it feasible to deploy into a company. And so I think that's why it's so important that the second part of the definition that Shani spoke about is access to tools. What tools can the agent access to complete the task? Because if the agent can't complete the task by accessing one of those software tools, it defaults to querying a large language model. And then all of those risks around hallucination, sounding very confident but being very wrong, starts to get introduced into work that is highly sensitive, and obviously clients are paying a lot of money to get a very well polished product. So I think that's why we have to be very careful here of just trying to put agent stuff on marketing material without being very clear what it is, what it can do, what it can't do, because the risks are quite high. And so last point from me, something we'll always do whenever we demonstrate our agentic capabilities is we start the call by defining what an agentic system is, and it sets the stage for the rest of the call, right? Because if there's not a common understanding or common language around what we're talking about, then people are just going to say stuff for the sake of saying stuff to close a deal, and that creates a whole bunch of terrible outcomes for everyone involved.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, and I'd be curious, I don't know if people listening, I'm curious as to what the pressure on end users to use agentic technology, whether there's so many different pressures that come right now. Sometimes it's because you want to be seen to be using the latest technology. Sometimes it's because your clients are pressuring you, saying, and forgive me, ridiculous RFPs, like what agentic technology are you using? And actually that's not helpful. And sometimes it's just a misunderstanding because you've been missold, and taking your point, this is really cool. So we don't want to be agent bashing. I quite like that instead of agent washing. We don't want to be agent bashing, because actually, as you said, it's amazingly cool, but so sometimes for very good reasons. So it'd be interesting if anyone wants to share as to what your sort of thoughts or drivers are, because I know ILTA just published their annual technology survey, and it's really fascinating. I can share the results of that particular question with the feedback from this session. But there's a very small number of people that are actually using agentic, but there are quite a lot of people who are trialing it. So it'd be quite interesting to sort of see what the drivers are.
Sorry, and maybe just before.
Yeah.
I would be interested to see what people chat about, but at least when we've built a lot of our systems, we've done so alongside the lawyers that use our product. And I think Shani can talk a little bit more detail around some of the technical side of things. I think the technical ability of agentic systems is not the question here at all. It's not the problem, right? These are highly capable. What it is trust, right? Like that is what it comes to, is more and more you are outsourcing parts of your work that you identified or associated your job with to agentic systems. Now, to the individual, that raises a whole bunch of questions around your value and your worth and all of these kind of things. But even more so, it's about, we haven't shifted liability. So like, it's an interesting point, right? One of the biggest issues with trying to get automated cars onto the road is not the sophistication of the software, it's getting insurance cover. If you Ford, you're going to roll out 20,000 automated vehicles that can drive on the road, you suddenly become liable for 20,000 potential accidents, whereas historically that's been pushed onto the driver, right? So what's happening is the lawyers in the law firm are still responsible for the output of the agent, right? So they are still responsible and liable for the accuracy, validity of that output. And they are outsourcing a big portion of that to the agent itself. So liability shifts with the lawyer, but they're not doing all of the work, and that creates anxiety and a lack of trust. And so part of that, and Shani, maybe we should talk about, again, this is not just about us, but talking to vendors, is how are you solving for that trust? How is a lawyer going to learn slowly and incrementally to use these systems more and more? Maybe we should talk about LangGraph a little bit, or other things that you can do to be smart about that.
I think this is also where just transparency of exactly what the agentic system is doing becomes so important, because I don't think, at least I don't look at it like we're building systems that can completely automate what a lawyer does. I feel like we're building the super assistants that makes their work much better, and they can focus on the important stuff, right? So if we show exactly like this clause here that I used as a precedent to do this kind of work, I retrieved it from this document, that is like, and you give a really thorough trace of exactly what tools it used, what were the inputs to these tools, what did it retrieve. I think that can, then basically you've gone away from saying, here's an output that you need to trust, and I'm not going to tell you how I created it, to more like, here, I just did a whole workflow for you that would have taken you an hour to like find this clause, find that document. Here it all is, and now you can do your work much faster in a much better way than you could without it. So like, it's about finding these kinds of things. Like, we're not trying to tell them just use this output and trust it. It's more like work that requires no skill but would take 1 hour to do. We've done it all for you. Focus on the important stuff. That's where the beauty happens, in my opinion.
Yeah, in fact, because you met someone, in terms of black box, so actually it almost, tell me if you think I'm wrong, takes away from this being black box technology, right? So actually people don't often know the working or the reasoning necessarily, but actually if with agentic AI, it's showing you its homework, it's showing you how it's done it. And actually, I suppose perhaps we should also talk about the fact that you can backtrack. You can sort of say, actually, I'm not happy, particularly at the moment in that building trust stage. You'll have probably the steps on the right hand side with, and this is the source, these are the sources, these are the tools, this is how I've got to where I've got, and you can check and say, yes, I'm okay, I'm happy with that. And there's a very much at the moment with the agentic AI that I've seen, including yours, it's a very much human in the loop process, which query, does that still make it agentic AI? I suppose we could have a conversation about that, but that, we need it right now in terms of trust.
But I think this is like, so I think the biggest fault with like, when you just had the LLMs and you were trying to do legal work, like you were basically having a generative model just produce it from nothing, right? And it's impossible for it to give you a good output based on the context of your contract and what your law firm does. But like, the beauty of agentic AI is that like, the importance is less in the generation. Like I said, like the LLM, like we use it mainly as a reasoning layer, but everything is done based, like if you have the right tools, everything is done, like, because if you're drafting, let's say, an interest clause, if you know exactly which clause the LLM retrieved to draft it, you can see that clause, you can see that it just changed few details to fit within your contract. contract, it's much easier to trust it, right? And it actually saves you a lot of time instead of just getting some random boilerplate thing that it was trained on that is nothing like your precedent. So I think that's like a big thing about agentic systems, is that it goes away from just being generation from a model to actually doing the work like you would do it. And I think that will build trust in the long term.
Sorry, Reece, yeah, go.
We always say it's like when calculators were a big thing at school and the maths teacher wanted to make sure that you were actually doing the work, they would say, show your workings.
Yeah.
It's always that, right? It's like, don't just show me the answer. I want to see how you went there, because once the lawyer starts to realize, or any end user for that fact, that the way the agent is going about solving for the task mirrors the way they would go about solving for the task, it starts to build trust. And they get more confident that, okay, this agentic system is emulating the way that I would do it, but it's just doing it at 1/10 of the speed. And so that transparency around explaining what you're doing, but also having the audit trail that Shani spoke about what data did you access, what did you do with it? And I see there's a question, that's a good point.
Yeah, no, so it's perfect timing, because I was just going to come on to proprietary data and I'm going to dive into that. But so there's an observation which we can comment on. It's not necessarily a question, but I think the biggest issue, our listener says, I think the biggest issue is source data. Lots of people are wanting to set up agents without thinking about the work required to ensure the source data is right, trusted, and properly managed. Agents won't be the answer if you don't have high quality source data, which we're going to come on to dive into. But what are your sort of observations off the bat on that?
I think it's absolutely spot on. If agents are accessing data that is really bad, the work that they will deliver is really bad, and it's important. There are two parts of it. There's a lot of guardrails and techniques that the providers like us can do to make sure that the most relevant data is picked. So that is also that, and that determines a lot the quality of different products, I would say. So that is definitely something that you can build competitive advantage of if you know what you're doing. But second off, obviously, like I think there will be a bit more emphasis for law firms, especially now when you have these systems, to get your DMS into order, which I know can be a big ask. But yeah, like if the agentic systems are running on your data, you want to make sure they're running on the right data, especially when you're when junior people are using those systems. So I don't know, Reece, if you have different thoughts than I do on that, but
no, I mean that's exactly it, right? Is what data is it using to produce the output, and it has to be your data. And I think more so than ever, the work of knowledge lawyers is becoming basically the pivot point for a firm's moat and competitive differentiation. Because if you think about it, the knowledge work that lawyers do, all of that ultimately gets trapped in the four corners of a contract, right? That is where all of that sits. Yes, a partner might leave and they might leave the firm, but all of that knowledge that, for example, they've built up and all that expertise over time is still trapped in those contracts that they've drafted, in that historic knowledge, which previously it's sat there in a DMS system, but it's being completely inaccessible, right? And so that ability to bring that data to the fore, maintain that competitive advantage, and be able to very quickly repurpose that data to turn around contracts or whatever it might be that mirror how you've done things in the past is everything. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have this erosion of the competitive advantage that law firms hold over their clients, and then anything that becomes commoditized leads to a drop in pricing power, and that's the last thing we all want, right? So what you need to be able to show clients is that we're building these systems, but we're building it on our knowledge. And actually, we might not have as many associates or senior associates doing client-facing work, but all of those associates and senior associates are turning inwards, right? And we consistently curating this knowledge bank to make sure that it is up to date based on new case law, new regulations, new filings, new things happening with the transaction, so that the data is consistently clean. I think that's how law firms are going to start to structure themselves, because, I mean, we all know they're the big legal database providers out there that have also built their own agent or their own way to communicate with that data. The risk of saying, well, I use that system to create my contracts, the client's just going to go like, all right, cool, I'm just going to buy that product and disintermediate yourself completely from the process, right? So I think to that point, it's pivotal, and
Yeah.
that's integration piece is so important because the integration means your data.
And
Is
it's
that- Sorry, Shani.
yeah, sorry, just no point. Like, I mean, like if we we can go deeper into this a bit later, but like when we talk about like what is the one thing you need to think about when you're creating an agentic system, it's what we call context engineering, which basically just what is the context that you're getting. Like you like if you're a law firm that has this kind of a data and you've structured it correctly, but like nobody will be able to replicate what you can do because you're the only one that owns that data. And with that context inside of these models, that is incredibly powerful, and nobody will be able to replicate that with general models. Like I would say that quite confidently.
But what are the key issues? So is it integration? So I think it depends. I talk about Gen AI, agentic AI in the round, and it can be the issues in terms of augmenting the LLM with your own data. There's different issues that different sectors face. So if you're talking about Copilot, for example, just as one example, it might be because they're fearful of opening up all of their data, so you can't, for example, say what's market. It's one example that I recently gave, because actually it doesn't have access to your data. In this context, where you're talking about, you're doing contract drafting, etc. Is it integration? What are the key issues that firms are facing in terms of? I couldn't agree more in terms of in terms of really protecting and accelerating your secret sauce. Like actually there's so many ways that done properly, this can really give you that competitive edge, can't it? Because in terms of speed or even accuracy or the ability to just to have that breadth of knowledge across all of these different types of contracts or data, whatever your data source is. But what are the key issues in your space that you're seeing in terms of why firms are struggling to access or augment the AI with their own data? Is it integration?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is the amount of law firms right now that are doing huge KM projects of like cleaning their data sets to make them viable to launch these kind of products. That is probably the biggest push that we see with law firms, is like they see the value of these tools, they understand that they need these tools, but they also understand that the power of those tools depends on what metadata is assigned to each contract. There is also obviously one of the big things is making sure that the contracts that are being used don't have client data in it, right? That's a huge cleaning process.
Yeah.
And so what we see with some of the big firms we're working with is typically not every practice area is created equal. So, if you take a practice area like structured finance, for example, or real estate, usually there's sometimes a smaller cohort of contract types that they're consistently working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so their database is typically cleaner and requires less cleaning, version control, all of these kind of things. And you can start there and build out the sort of business case, the value proposition, show that with the right environment, this works. And then you basically bring online practice areas as each of them sort of start to come on board, right? And I think it is a bit of a kind of crawl, walk, run. Anyone that's saying, let's just start whole bank shoot, load your DMS and fire this out to 3,000 lawyers, like run from that vendor. Like we're all figuring to go.
You can and using AI to create that metadata or improve the metadata. That's kind of really super cool. Because this,
that's real.
All of us get really excited about that. Let's just quickly, let's come back to that because I just want to encourage people to ask questions and I'm ignoring somebody. But let's come back to using AI for the tagging and categorization because it's super important. So when deciding, I know I'm pointing at the screen with my finger, when deciding on an agentic legal product, how important do you think it is to query the legal architecture of it? Thanks for that. Anyone?
So can you repeat that question? Sorry, I didn't quite get that. To query the...
When deciding on an agentic legal product, how important do you think it is to query the legal architecture of it?
Okay. I'll try to answer it like I understand it, but just drop a message if I misunderstood the question. But I think there is one thing that when I think about the legal architecture of it, I'm gonna understand it as how good it is and how optimized it is as reading legal contract versus just general text. That's how I'm going to understand it. And I think that is hugely important, if I'm being completely honest. So, and especially when you get to the large contracts, let's say 300, 400, 500 pages, and you're linking support documents to it. As we all know, contracts are very structured. We structure them in a certain way, and large language models are not going to understand that structure and be very good at querying it if you just copy paste them all into it. And even for the larger contracts, it's not going to fit into it at all. So having vendors that have specifically optimized how do I break up a contract, and how do I do the context engineering correctly to feed the correct information into an LLM to solve for legal tasks. At least right now, we're still at a place where that is incredibly important. And that is just confirmed by all the benchmarks we have, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Only on that, not to now make this Caroline and myself asking you questions on a webinar, but what questions do you think you should ask a vendor that would uncover how they've thought about that? Is it purely like, do you have a team of lawyers that analyze the output to validate the accuracy? Is it that plus what kind of RAG system do you use? Like what, because anyone can say, oh yeah, it's legal. Like what are the actual questions you should be asking that would uncover whether it's marketing or whether it's actually like genuine.
I think there's one thing that I would say you can immediately spot if they're just pushing everything into an LLM or if they're doing something smart. It's how long is the contract they can support. Very often you see that the length of the contract they can support is basically equal to the length of the context window of the latest large language models. And that kind of gives it immediately that, like, look, if you can't support, like, there's no reason why a good provider couldn't support like over 1,000 pages, honestly, if they've done it correctly. And if they've really understood how to break down and parse a contract, they can do it. If they can't, they're probably passing the whole contract into the large language model. I would also ask them just in general, like, what tools does your system have access to? And just like get them to explain what are those tools and what do they do? I would expect some of these tools to be tools that specifically go towards providing it with that structure of the contract. If they don't mention it, I would be a bit wary, if I'm being honest. And those are probably, and then also just ask, like, what are the end-to-end workflows that your system can solve for? Because that will give you a lot of thoughts. But yeah, those are probably things I would have in mind if I was choosing a provider.
So you go straight in with who do you integrate with? And what's kind of missing?
Not just who do you integrate with, but also just like, because a lot of the tools can be internal, right? But those internal tools, at the very least, be focused on how do we parse legal contracts, right? Yeah. And honestly, I think as soon as you see how many pages it can support, it will tell you everything.
Would you also go in with, so we'll talk a bit about whether you need an agentic solution, but would you also go in with what's the most cost-effective solution? Would you perhaps sort of put them on the spot with that?
I think it's always a difficult thing when, I think, yeah, like, I mean, obviously, if you see two providers that seem to be benchmarked and doing quite as similarly, but they're priced differently economically, you should be thinking about that. But it can be quite difficult when we live in a world where VCs throw in hundreds of millions of dollars, and you know that providers are basically selling their product on a loss. Then I think those questions can get a bit blurry, but I'm sure Reese also has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think the use case, it's such an important question, right? Like, we've seen a few. I mean, we by no means an old company, but legal tech is quite nascent. I think we like startup years are like dog years sometimes, right? Like, you've been around for a decent amount of time. Nothing has changed with the fact of, like, technology always needs to solve for a problem, right? That is, like, it's so simple, but you can tell straight away on a demo where someone clicks a button, they're like, and that's Gen AI, and this is an agent. It's like, no, I don't care. Like, I do not care, actually. Tell me, what is the problem that you're solving? Talk to me about the day-to-day of the person that's going to be using the product. What does it look like before? What does it look like afterwards? And there needs to be a material gain in that outcome for that product to ultimately be something that you're interested in, right? And it's so interesting because you look at, like, you actually dig into the outputs of what's going on, and you look at some of the use cases, and like, we scratch our heads sometimes, right? It's like, what is the main use case for generative AI and legal? And it's like, to summarize a contract. And I'm like, that is a good use case. But I was a lawyer for 5 years. I didn't summarize a contract once, right? Like, I was not getting sent a contract by my client and charging a ridiculous charge out rate to say, here's a summary of it. I was actually drafting the contract in the first instance. And then you get things like due diligence, which is an incredibly powerful use case. Of course, I want to be able to look at a large corpus of data, extract change of control provisions, any adverse supplier terms, anything that might be at risk for me if I'm going to acquire a target company. But again, I think Kira launched that market 10 years ago, right? And they've trained a machine learning model that is incredibly good at extracting that sort of data. So yes, that is a good use case for potentially generative AI solutions. But again, very expensive problem that you're solving for. And so just keep going back to the use cases, and then you can do a horizon mapping of who else solves for these use cases and why. Because, the information security process you're going to run through to inject 6 large language models and agentic system into your firm needs to be robust, and also needs to be able to make sense in the context of what is the value of the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think nothing, no matter how advanced the technology is, has changed the basic question of what problems are you solving for, and what is the value of that problem to my lawyers, to my clients, to my operations.
Workforce and why would a lawyer care if I used an LLM or something else to solve their problem if I do it accurately? Why have we gotten into a nature that is what matters? That I used an LLM to do it. It's sometimes weird.
I do think it's a good point, because I feel like at the moment people feel like the world has turned on its head, and those first principles to some extent in some cases have gone out the window. So that's a really great reminder, because in some cases we're being told, we've always said, start with a problem, and fix that, and don't just sort of use technology for the sake of it. I do feel like recently a lot of the conversations I've been having, that has changed to a certain extent. People are getting more comfortable with putting technology in people's hands and seeing what they do with it. We're being some of the first principles are, in some cases rightly, some cases wrongly, going out the window. I do think, there's a valid, there've been some amazing results in terms of how are they going to use this bit of technology, and it's not a stupid thing. But this is a really important point, actually, when you come to this sort of thing with where you've got agentic AI, where you're claiming to solve a problem and you're saying, right, you need this solution. Actually, what are you solving and how are you doing it? I think you almost like you're going back to those first principles, which probably people feel quite comfortable with, thank God for that.
It's exactly, sometimes, and look, experimentation is different to these kind of things, right? Experimentation is critical. You should put new technology in front of someone and say, would you see value in this, right? And I think that's important. And using Azure's AI environments and playing around with OpenAI and models and Copilot within SharePoint and their agents, that's a really cool place to experiment. And usually innovation and internal teams should be doing that as a matter of course. I think it's different when a vendor is potentially trying to charge you quite a lot of money and saying, here's the technology, can you tell me what we can do with it? You should hold them to a higher standard, because it's interesting, right? Sometimes there is a bit of okay, buy the technology and then we'll work with you to figure out use cases. That was the no code era 4 years ago. We seem to be circling back, and we is wondering, no, well, that's just no code, which is basically low code. And so it's no, show me your use cases, show me the value. Yes, new use cases might materialize, but if I'm going to pay X, I need to at least see a 5 or 10x return on what I'm paying, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's, with the large language models being so readily accessible via the cloud systems and stuff that people operate internally, external vendors that do come and say, well, it's legally fine-tuned, it's ABC, should be held to a much more rigorous standard, as opposed to we still figuring it out.
Yeah. And actually, when I asked about the most cost effective, I'll put them on the spot about the most cost effective. Is it the most cost effective solution? I think, Shawnee, you went into your startup mode. What I was really meaning was you were like the founder, talking. But actually, I was thinking more in terms of them demonstrating that the agentic compared with the next solution is the best one, why they need it, you know, like actually, right, this is in terms of providing you with some kind of like cost rationale as to, okay, this is why you need agentic, this is why it's going to save you money in the long run, this is why it's the most cost effective solution for you as the end user.
Yep. I mean, the vendor should always be able to explain to you why you need an agentic system to solve for this problem and why only an agentic system to solve for that problem. I think that's like just number one, right? Is okay, why do I need this specific set of systems to solve for this problem? And they should have a very good answer for that.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. And you see, presumably they're not doing that right now. Jump in by all means. If I wonder if people, you know, if you'll share some of your, you know, perhaps the good, the bad, and the ugly of any of your experiences.
My worry is I'm going to jump onto a demo with some of the people on this call, and I'm going to have all of our own questions thrown back at me, and I should have given away secrets.
So fine. So I'm not sure. So I think we've covered a lot about proprietary data. So I mean, perhaps one thing we didn't touch on, which I think might be worth talking about, is an agent being able to refine itself based on proprietary data. Do you think that's worth doing a little bit more of a dive into in terms of the functionality?
Yeah, sure. Shani, do you want to jump from the contextual editing and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think it's like it's similar to it, like I guess like what people mean when they say refine itself based on the data, because like you're not going to be fine-tuning the model itself, in my opinion, based on data. Like that is like I can go in depth or so, like that is not a realistic thing. And if somebody says they're doing it, I would question them. But when I think about refining the agents towards your data or your proprietary data, it means again the correct taking in the correct context of what you need to like basically like if I'm solving a task, if I'm doing something like the user wants me to do a certain workflow, the LLM is trained on very general data, right? And it has a lot of knowledge. But to make it refined to your own data, that's again about retrieving the correct sources, either from your DMS, the contracts you're working on, emails, stuff like that, and then that into the context of the LLM, it will base its answers based on that. Just imagine if you're drawing, let's say you want an LLM to draft you an interest clause. If you go on ChatGPT now and you ask it that, it's going to give you a very generic interest clause. If you then go into a contract that you own and that you worked on, and you copy paste that interest clause, you can copy paste that into ChatGPT and say, draft me an interest clause using this as precedent. You're going to get a very different answer, right? So it's all about basically bringing the right things into the context, and that's how you read, like that's how you refine the agent to actually use your data and becoming really good at that. And like that is the key of everything, in my opinion, when you're building agentic systems. I think
I think I was thinking something different actually when we were talking about refining. I was thinking almost like about so perhaps it's my sort of, I was going off on a tangent in my own head. I was thinking about almost like correcting its own work, you know, as opposed to that's what I was meaning, and I probably expressed it wrongly, because I think we've already did a little bit of a dive into the context engineering. So I was thinking more like that's quite an interesting thing, you know, about agents being able to correct themselves. That's something that we haven't really touched on, which I thought was quite interesting, jumping around a little bit.
It 100% is. And I mean, I think that's built into any serious agentic system, is that loop where you have another large language model that is instructed in a certain way. It might even be structured in a way that is even based on some custom rules for yourself or based on your data. And you get it to check the results of what is there and check for certain things that it needs to be aware of. And if it sees any of them, it brings it back to the main agentic system. That is definitely a big part of any agentic system, and it's really powerful, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Reese, sorry.
Reese, you wanted to say something?
The other big question with these things is like, there is a lot of like, what can it do? And then there's a question of like, should it do it, right? Now, as a lawyer, and this is why for us, the UI UX component of building these things is just so critical, right? Because if I open a chatbot, for example, I just see a blank screen. Like, how do I figure out how powerful is this? What can it do? What problems can it solve for? I'm imposing that burden on the end user, which is unfair, right? Whereas with these systems, for example, how do you think about saying to the user, here are the 10 main things I can do. Click on this. Okay, do you want me to do this? And it follows sort of like a decision tree. But at the same time, again, it's about bringing the user on the journey so that they have confidence in the output. If the agent goes and does something and says, oh, by the way, I did this and I made 100 corrections whilst I was doing it, here's the output, you'll be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And what are the 100 corrections that you did? I need to go like verify this. Whereas opposed to if you could say, look, okay, I've gone and found this clause. Is this right? And you can say yes, or you're almost there, but can you make it a clause, but it's only a clause that's been worked on by this partner or for this specific client? Cool, I'll go do that. Are you happy with this? I think, to that crawl, walk, run analogy, in 3, 4, 5 years, once that trust is there, you'll probably have, lawyers just using agents to complete those tasks simultaneously to make that much more efficient. But we have to just kind of slowly get people using it, adopting it, kind of getting comfortable with these tools, because it is a huge adjustment to how you work and how you value your job, right? Which is a very important thing of fulfillment. And there's psychological elements here at play as well, which makes all of this a very interesting kind of process around change management and adoption.
I've seen we're going to come on. Sorry, Shani. Yep.
Just one thing as well, because we talked about that and building that trust, but also how they refine their own outputs. I think there's also a way to build that trust, and because it doesn't necessarily have to be an agent looking at the output from an agent. One thing that you can do is you can use deterministic products that the lawyer trusts, without wanting to go into the family. But one refinement that you can make is make sure before it outputs something, it runs the proofreading tool through it and make sure it didn't make and corrects itself based on that. So also integrate it into that workflow of the agent, self-correctiveness, where it's using tools that the lawyer already knows they can trust and are deterministic. I think that's also a pretty important part to build that trust and also make sure the output is really good. I think so that's an important part in my opinion.
I'm going to come on to there's a couple of questions. I think within the in-house sector, it's fascinating as to the level of trust already with some agentic AI systems. I think, and that's another conversation. Perhaps we'll have time to come on and touch on that. But I think because it's obviously, I think their own data and that makes a big difference. So, and actually perhaps on a similar vein as to who's using agentic, but this is more in terms of departments. So we know legal we know legal isn't always the first mover when it comes to technology. Sorry, don't need to say sorry, we'd agree. Have you seen any adjacent functions, e.g. HR, finance, already rolling out agentic AI that are impacting legal departments or forcing them to adhere to a separate tool? Or is this an area where legal could really lead?
So it's a great question. So the general trend that we've seen is there is sort of now this bifurcation, especially with in-house teams, right? But it also applies to law firms, where firms have first and foremost solved for breadth as opposed to depth. So we need to deploy one broad-based generative AI solution across the business or across the firm that solves for a set of general tasks pretty well, right? Whether that's draft me an email, create a memo, help me refine this language, make sure this is written in accordance with the house language or whatever it might be. That general purpose tool, whether it is maybe legal specific or maybe it's a Copilot hooked up to SharePoint, which, Caroline, is one reason why in-house might be a little bit further ahead, is because they're already in SharePoint and that's easier to deploy Microsoft Copilot. But there is usually this general purpose tool that they would then adopt. And then what we see now more recently as a trend is they're fairly comfortable that they covered themselves from a generic general purpose solution. And now they're going into specific areas to solve for depth. So they're looking at, okay, everyone has access to some tool to get a lot of the menial stuff done, but let's look at the functions in this business across legal, HR, finance, sales, procurement, and start to build for depth or bring in external solutions that solve for, let's say, the tip of the spear in that specific area or discipline. And I think their legal is leading the way because it is just such an obvious one, right? It is just one that when you look at these technologies makes the most sense as a starting point. that legal is starting to be that first kind of tool to bring in specific solutions that are tailored for their specific needs. And, that's equal of law firms. So we typically see people will bring in their broad-based, whatever it is, solution, and then they will say, okay, well, we need to bring in something for the IP team. We need to bring in something for the employment team, for tax, something that, as Shani said, is highly, highly tuned towards these specific practice areas and transactional and whatever it might be. So definitely agree that legal can lead when it comes to in-house. Once there's been that general purpose rollout, they are the natural next step for a more specific solution.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, someone pointed out that, in terms of us legal trailing, that previously, we really haven't had great tech. It's been around, Excel or, but now we're in the word game, and now we have a huge opportunity to leverage technology with generative AI and agentic AI. So there's another question. So I mean, this is an interesting one. So with the growing number of data centers, do you think sustainability will become a factor when considering agentic AI tools? And I've seen some fascinating talks on this. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I think this goes back to our earlier point, right? Like, do you need an agentic system to solve for this problem? It's the most expensive, and I mean expensive not just in terms of like what it costs you, but the toll on the environment, the toll on all of these data centers is like, always think like it's the most, what's it, cracking a walnut with a sledgehammer or whatever it is, right? Like if you say, okay, this is a use case we want to solve for, then do I need this system to solve for it? Very often there is no need to have that complex a system solving for that simpler task. And then you're right, then it's incredibly expensive and it's incredibly unsustainable to be deploying that. And so you should always be saying, okay, I can understand why I would only need this system to complete this task. And then you should sort of ask questions around, where's your data hosting, or, how are you deploying that data? Where are you pulling it from? And it's an unanswered question right now, right? People are building data centers and people are building power plants at a rate of knots. And it's something that we have to see shake out, but it definitely should become a factor.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I saw an amazing talk by Judge Victoria McLeod talking about how we're competing for the same water, right? Water is, and resource that's not enough supply as it is, and we're going to be competing for the same. Do you think law firms? So it's interesting. You obviously, I'm not within a law firm, and it's funny. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I was speaking to somebody the other day who was talking about they obviously, get to the limit of their tokens or their usage for that day, and then they get kind of cut off. So, do you think that Well, you're laughing, reasons.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
It's so funny because it's until someone says something, you're like, oh, that's how it happens. So, but with agentic, I suppose, could it be to force? Would this be a user decision in some ways? Could it be that the firm goes, right, you've got this, you've got this capacity, and you almost put it on the user, or will it be more of a, a firm at an IT level will be making these decisions in terms of the kind of workflow or what technology you use?
So I guess it depends on the system, right? So first and foremost, and this goes back to something you should ask your vendors should give you a single price for the year that absorbs tokenization and cloud computing costs, right? It is not on you to necessarily have to then have that cost separate to the software. So if you have an external vendor, and I'm not talking about Microsoft, right? I think we all have limited negotiating power against Microsoft, but if you are talking to a legal technology vendor, and they're sending you a price, be very, very specific about what is included in that cost, right? Because the way that agents work, and Shani, can I correct me if I'm wrong, is sometimes there's an orchestrator agent that sits under the task level that decides what large language model it's going to use to complete that task. It makes that decision autonomously. It might go to a model that doesn't charge a tokenization cost, but it might also choose a model that's got a tokenization cost, and those costs can ramp up quickly. And so the vendor, if they're willing to build these complex tools, need to be sophisticated enough to know how to price them, right? So it should be a fixed cost on that one. Obviously, when it comes to if you have an Azure environment and your IT team has Azure systems and they want to control the cloud computing costs, I think you should, maybe there might be caps, maybe there won't be caps. But at that point, at least there should be clear communication from the IT teams and that kind of stuff about that. and also translating what tokenization means in the context of what you can do. Because sometimes you just, I want to go for dinner at this place within a 5-mile radius, and then next thing you have to write an email and you've used all your tokens trying to find a good restaurant to go to that night. So knowing the capacity or limits of what you can and can't do is important, and you should expect your internal teams to be able to communicate that to you.
Shani, did you want to add anything?
No, I think it's just to echo this point. I think it's key that agentic systems can go really off-road and use a lot of tokens, and it should definitely be on the provider to make sure it controls that, and that the client can't just have used all its tokens up, because the agentic system took a pretty bad decision as well, because it can roll up really quickly when the agentic infrastructure is not built correctly.
Yeah. Well, look, guys, I think unless there's anything else, so we've got, I think we're kind of getting to the wrap up. I think, and we've got people that, have been with us. Thank you so much for all your questions. It's been really interesting. I think maybe just as a conclusion, I think it's probably important to reiterate, agentic AI, I think Reece, you called it a serious technology. It's not a gimmick, but so we're not in any way saying that, but just, it's really important to understand it has very real constraints, very real parameters, and those are something that you need to understand. So boo to agent washing, we say. I'm just reading my conclusion. I think that was pretty sort of intelligent sounding. Did you have anything you wanted to add as we wrap up? I'm sorry, there's one question which we'll have to come to because it's like 1 minute left, but was there anything else you wanted to say in conclusion?
No, I've just really enjoyed it, and I think it's useful that we can use these conversations to break away from the buzzwords and the marketing to actually just talk honestly about what's going on, because I think vendors and customers are very much in this together. There are things that we are kind of still working out, and you should expect your vendors to be honest about what they do know and what are the limits and what are the constraints and what they are still figuring out, as opposed to just trying to close a deal for the sake of closing a deal that's unfair on the people being sold to.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better.
I like that. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Actually love these conversations. So helpful to me as well. So appreciate it. We're all on this journey together, and certainly as journalists, we get a lot of communication around agent and agentic AI. So it's super helpful and educational for me as well. So I really appreciate you making the time, and I really appreciate everybody joining and asking your questions. And we will be doing follow-up. So if you've got any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask, then please do share those with me, and I can share them with the guys. Thank you so much.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.